Welcome to Chapter 10, Social and Personality Development in the Preschool Years. When we talk about the preschool years, we're talking about the age of about 3 to 6 years old, and kids during that age are trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to get some autonomy, and during this time, they're starting to get very curious and learn about themselves. Things that happen during this stage can affect them for the rest of their life, especially if you think about the psychodynamic perspective. When we talk about Erikson and his psychosocial theories of development, children and adults and all of us go through stages where we have a conflict to resolve. In early childhood, when we talk about this stage, these preschool years, this 3 to 6 time, we have a conflict of initiative versus guilt. Earlier on, if you remember, we started with trust versus mistrust from 0 to 18 months, autonomy versus shame and doubt from 18 months to 3 years, and then from 3 to 6, we're talking about initiative versus guilt. And so it's sort of that sense of developing independence and being allowed some freedom in making some decisions for ourselves. An example of this would be a child who goes upstairs and it's in the morning, they're getting dressed, and they put on a feather boa, and they have striped pants and a plaid shirt and a tutu and cowboy boots, and they come downstairs and they're all ready for school. And they're all proud of themselves because they put themselves together, they put this outfit together, and they come downstairs, and the parent can have a variety of different responses, one of which could be, you look ridiculous, go change, you can't leave the house like that. And so here's this child who showed initiative, trying to do something for themselves, and getting that negative response can cause the child to develop a sense of guilt. Whereas if they came downstairs and the parent said something like, "Oh, I see you put your outfit together all by yourself, you got dressed yourself," and acknowledge the effort, that can often help kids develop that sense of initiative. You don't have to give artificial praise and tell them they look great, because they very well may not look great, but you can acknowledge that effort. That can kind of go back to that extra credit assignment with the praise. That podcast can help you out with that a little bit as well. Our self-concept is our identity. It's our set of beliefs about what we're like and who we are. And that who am I question that children think about can affect us for the rest of our lives. Kids often overestimate what they're capable of doing at a young age. They think they're experts at everything. Later on, we kind of get our egos slammed in a variety of ways that can affect our self-esteem later on. But self-concept and self-esteem are two different things. Depending on our culture, there's a lot of different ways people take part in being a part of a culture, or if they're more independent. The collectivistic orientation, that's a more Asian perspective, a more Eastern perspective, and it's more of interdependence, blending in, being interconnected. And that's the one we talked about earlier in the semester, I think, about the nail that stands out gets pounded. The individualistic orientation is more of the Western American, Western Europe view of trying to be unique, a lot of competition, personal identity, and that one would be the squeaky wheel gets the grease. By the time they are 3 or 4 years old, young children, can distinguish between members of different races, and they can begin to understand how that matters in our society. Some experience race dissonance, and this is when children in the minority show preferences for the majority values or people. So they would be more likely, when shown a picture of a black person and a white person, to think that the white person is the good guy and the black person is the bad guy. Even African American children seem to show preference for Caucasian dolls when they are asking, "Oh, Santa, can I have this doll?" They tend to be more likely to ask for the white version of the doll. I think we talked earlier in the semester about the difference between sex and gender. Sex typically refers to sexual anatomy, biologically being a boy or a girl. Gender is the sense of maleness or femaleness, and it's established pretty early on. Even in early preschool, children tend to be pretty sexist, if you think about it. They tend to follow a lot of social stereotypes about what's appropriate for girls and what's appropriate for boys. And these strong gender stereotypes come out in different ways from different theorists. Some of what makes maleness and femaleness more significant is hormones, and they can be sex-related biological characteristics. They can affect how a person thinks and how they behave. There's definitely biological differences in the structure of the male brain and the female brain. Freud talked about identification in the psychoanalytic perspective. Identification occurs with young children around 5, 6 years old. When he talked about boys, he said boys have the Oedipal conflict. And according to Freud, around that age, boys tend to fall in love with their mothers and become very have a strong affinity for their mother. He said it was a sexual interest. I don't think that it would go quite that extreme, but that they had a strong affinity for their mothers, and so they hated their fathers. And it goes back to the story of Oedipus Rex, who, not knowing that this woman is his mother, he ends up sleeping with her, and not knowing this other person is his biological father, ends up killing his father. So what ends up happening, though, in a healthy, normally developing family dynamic, according to Freud, is that the boy begins to see how the mother loves the father. He ends up wanting to be like the father through the process called identification. And this is actually on the early childhood MTEL, only they kind of make it not Freudian, and they talk about it as identifying with an important person in their life, and they don't bring gender or sex into it. Freud also believed that girls had penis envy, and that girls were inferior to boys and always wanting to be boys. So he definitely had some interesting theories in regard to that. Back in chapter 2, we talked about Bandura and the social cognitive learning theory. And children also, it's about modeling. Children see how the men in their lives behave and how the women in their lives behave. And so they often find that they get kind of an internal reward or even external reward for behaving in the gender quote-unquote appropriate manner. Gender identity, gender schema, and gender constancy are some concepts talked about in this chapter. They're on page 252. I'm going to make sure we cover a lot of material in this chapter, so some things you're going to need to just kind of go take a peek at. This is Table 10-1 is different approaches to gender development. It's on page 253 in your book, so I'm not going to read it to you. I would definitely either hit pause and take a look at it, or take a look in your book. During the preschool years is when children start to make real friends. Prior to that, the children that you socialized with were most likely whoever your parents plopped you down next to, or whoever your caregiver in your daycare class might be. But around 3 years old, real friendships start to develop, and children realize that you get something out of friendship. That friendships are, you get companionship, you get play, you get entertainment. As we go through different stages of friendship, which I think we talk about further in chapter 13, but things like trust and support and shared interests come together. One of the things that we know about young children is that they learn through play, and that play is really important in child development. Some of the areas of play talked about in the book, functional play, constructive play, parallel play, onlooker play, associative play, cooperative play, we'll talk about. One of them is missing, though, that is not here, and that is socio-dramatic play. Socio-dramatic play involves pretend and pretending with other kids. If you think about the socio as social and dramatic, drama, as pretend, socio-dramatic play lets kids pretend in a way that's safe and risk-free. It's actually a question on the early childhood MTEL, and it's about how children, when they use sociodramatic play, are allowed to think and behave in more complex ways in a risk-free environment. Those words risk-free are kind of key here. In your book on page 255 is an explanation with descriptions and examples of different play types. Functional play is simple, repetitive, and I always think you can use Legos, and you could use that with any of these. So functional play may be taking two Legos and smacking them together or tapping them on a table. Constructive play would be putting the Legos together to build something. Parallel play is when children play next to each other. Each child would have their own toys or pile of toys, and they're doing something very similar, but they're not really interacting with each other. Associative play kind of builds off of parallel play. So they may be building their own thing or having their own toys, but they're sharing their material. So maybe if there's a pile of Legos, they're sharing the Legos. Can I take that one? So there's a little bit more interaction, but they're still not playing together and building together. Cooperative play is when they're building together. So that's thinking about maybe they're building the biggest tower in the world with those Legos, but together. Or they're doing something where they're taking turns or playing a game, but it's a together. Onlooker play is that when those, I always think it's a funny one because it shouldn't have the word play in it, but it's sort of the bystander who watches the other kids play. Maybe they're not quite ready to play with the other kids yet. This is that chart from your book, page 255. This looks at Korean American children versus Anglo-American children and just the different ways that they play. We talked about theory of mind in class, and it's the understanding of other children's emotions, and that other people have different perspectives than we do, and what goes on in other people's heads is different from what goes on in our own head. Thinking about the false belief task and activities such as that. Children who are on the autism spectrum have a difficult time in understanding other people's thinking may be different from our own. During the preschool years, there's a lot going on with the family, and during that time we're very much more involved with the family. As we get older and past into elementary school, we spend more hours of the day away from our families and caregivers. One of the topics in this chapter is parenting styles, and which parenting styles are more effective versus less effective. Authoritarian parents tend to be the strictest, very rigid views, and their word is law. You do what I say. Permissive parents tend to be lax and inconsistent. Maybe what the rule is one day might not be the rule the next day. Uninvolved parents are the ones who think my job is to put a roof over your head, food on the table, and it could be left at that. Authoritative parents tend to be the most nurturing. One of the key words with authoritative is that they are consistent. So the rules stay the same, and there's an explanation for why things are the way they are. They may be just as strict as authoritarian parents, but there's a warmth to it and an understanding. This chart takes a look at the responsiveness of each type, how demanding they are and how responsive, and it looks at, if you see authoritative parents, they're both, but if you see the uninvolved, they're neither, and the other two kind of fill out. There's many cultural differences in how people raise their children and what they believe the best way to parent is. On page 260, there's a piece on parenting coaches, and then if you look on the bottom part of that page, there's some discussion on Chinese parenting and some of the philosophy behind that. Moral development. Moral development looks at how we see right from wrong when we think about our ethical behavior. And when we talk about aggression, young children don't have control over their aggression yet and how they handle their aggression. And so as we develop, how we handle our understanding of right and wrong can change, and hopefully we learn to handle things using less and less aggression. Piaget said that moral development comes in 3 stages: the heteronomous morality stage, incipient cooperation, and autonomous cooperation. The story about the 2 little boys who broke the glasses, that hopefully we did on our field trip, is talked about on page 262. That's where that came from, a modified version. And one of the things that comes into play here is imminent justice. And imminent justice is not taking intent into consideration, and that consequences are immediate. A lot of the critics, when we talk about Piaget, think he underestimated what children are capable of, but as far as how moral development progresses, it does seem like he was on track. Pro-social behavior is behavior that's beneficial and helpful to others. If you think about antisocial behavior, not helping others and being maybe against society, pro-social is helpful. Abstract modeling is a concept where you don't have to actually have the experience, but just by observing somebody else behaving in a nice way or appropriately or doing kind things for other people, hopefully through abstract modeling, maybe you praise one child in a class for doing the right thing, and the other kids might notice and pick up on it, and it can have an impact on them as well. Please remind me to come back in class so that we talk about Piaget's stages of moral development as well. Empathy. Empathy is that understanding of other people's emotions. When we think about sympathy, sympathy is I feel bad for you. Empathy is more of I feel what you're feeling. And most theorists would say that children are not born understanding and having empathy, that is something we learn from the people around us. Aggression is an intentional injury or harm to another person. Handling aggression it often comes through emotional self-regulation, and that's when we learn how to control our own emotions. And even at the age of 2, children are able to talk about their emotions and be able to do that. We'll talk more in class, if you can bring this up and ask me, about instrumental versus relational aggression, and there's some differences with boys and with girls there. Social learning, we want to talk about Albert Bandura and the Bobo doll experiment. If you remind me, I will show you a video on that in class. Violence in the media there's a strong correlation that children who watch more violent television or more violent acts on television tend to have more violent behavior. This chart, if you want to take a peek at it, looks at the peak times of day, and this is in your book also, that there is violence on television. A lot of it is around the time kids are watching TV. Cognitive approach to aggression looks at how kids do learn their moral development and how it occurs throughout their development.